Hello and welcome everyone to the Global Business Leader Forum for the month of October. And today we will be spending time with Liz Wiseman, author of Multipliers, The Multipliers Effect, Rookie Smarts, and most recently released this work, Impact Players, How to Take the Lead, Play Bigger, and Multiply Your Impact. Liz really needs no introduction, and so I won't go into detail on her background. You can find that online, but I want to tell a little story before we bring Liz on. When we were preparing for our time today, Liz shared that during the time of COVID, that she spends the evenings helping teach and inspire high school students every evening by sharing a devotional with them like clockwork. So Liz is not only an expert on leadership, but also a servant leader herself. And you can learn a lot about a person when you just listen carefully to how they spend their free time. Liz, with that, welcome to the webinar.
Oh, Keith and everyone, it's good to be here. I have to make a little correction on that story because
Please.
I feel like I've gotten way more from my time with those teenagers than I've given to them. You know, they're pretty inspiring to me.
And it keeps us younger every year when we spend time with them, doesn't it?
Or
So
a whole lot older, depending on the day.
there we
I
go.
don't get anything. I don't understand it.
Well, let's go ahead and dig in. We've got a little less than an hour and we want to get some good discussions. Let's start out. So Impact Players was released earlier this week. I've got my copy. I've been working through it. What's the big idea in Impact Players? Take a moment. What's the big idea to share with our audience?
Well, I think the big idea really is that, to create an environment where people are at their best, a leader plays an important role in that, but so does the contributor, and the way the contributor shows up matters. And that there's a lot of really, and I think this is kind of the point, is that there's a lot of really smart, talented, capable, hardworking people who are working hard and who are contributing, but who are not having deep impact. That there's too many people who are going through the motions of work, but aren't feeling like they're making a difference. And, that difference making is not just a matter of circumstance. It's not a matter of how smart you are, how talented you are, and even how hard you're working. It really is a mindset and a way of working that causes some people to break through and have kind of disproportionate levels of influence and impact and value creation versus others.
And Liz, with the big idea in mind, why did you write the book? Okay, when did you decide to write the book and begin the research? What's the why behind the book?
Well, some of it is boredom, and it's not a lack of things to do. I have so many things to do, but
Right.
like sort of the way my mind is work. Like the president of Oracle once said, Liz, you are a dog on a bone, and he meant that in both a flattering and an unflattering ways. Like I tend to bite down on things, and then my dentist says I actually do this, and I like one of these jaw grinders in my sleep. So it's like that. Like I needed a new question, and multipliers has been kind of my life's work. Certainly, like the second part of my career. It still will forever be my life's work, but I was like, I need a new question to think about. And there were a couple things that led to it. The first is I'm out there, and I know so many people in this group have shared the ideas of multipliers and diminishers and accidental diminishers with teams. And as I've been doing that, I would get occasional warranty calls. And here's what I mean by that. Someone would raise their hand and be like, okay, I read your book, read that multipliers book, or, oh, I heard you speak, or I had a coach who helped. Like I did all those things, but yet my team didn't step up. Like I asked questions and they didn't have answers, and I gave them ownership and they dropped the ball. And so I was like, okay, well, what's going on there? And I think there's a bunch of things going on there. Like, well, maybe you tried some new behaviors, but you weren't very good at it yet. And that didn't go well. And and a group of coaches knows what that scenario looks like. Or maybe, you were doing the right things, but still with old thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, your hands and your mouth are kind of doing the right things, but your head's still thinking they're going to screw it up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe that's going on. Or maybe the people who are working for you have been diminished so long, they've learned to be a bit helpless. Like they've learned that, ooh, I touched that stove before and it was hot. So I know she's asking me questions, but I'm not sure I feel safe enough. And so as I was exploring, like, what are the reasons why people wouldn't step up? I'm like, oh yeah, there's a clear obligation of the leader, but there's also an obligation that comes with being the contributor.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was sort of one moment where I think it kind of came to a head for me. And I'm like, ooh, this is a fun question to bite down on. I'm at a workshop, and this was several years ago. And it was an engineering manager. I think this might have been at Salesforce. And I'm like kind of pouring my heart out. We're doing the whole multipliers thing. And he's like, yeah, kind of like this. I want to be a better leader. I want to be a multiplier. Like, I'm all for that. But he said, you can't multiply zero.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And I was like, kind of like, oh, wow, what does that mean? And my first fear was that what he was saying is like, I got a bunch of dummies working for me,
right?
Lackeys, and they're zero. And I was like, oh, I hope that's not what he's thinking, because I don't believe that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And then as he started talking it through, what he was saying is like, yeah, I get it. I need to show up with the right mindsets and practices as a leader. But so do the people who work for me. Like if they don't show up with the right mindsets and practices, like there's not a whole lot I can do with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, there is actually a whole lot you can do with it in terms of cultivating it. But it got me thinking, like, lots of us have been studying what like the new model of leadership needs to look like for this very uncertain, chaotic environment we find ourselves leading in.
Mm-hmm.
But, there are not a lot of people that have been studying what does like the new model of contributorship look like.
Right.
And I'm also like starting to process, like, wait a minute, we need, if managers are really going to lead, we need contributors and team members to be a lot more self-managing.
Mm-hmm.
Like in some ways, the book is my attempt to have contributors and team members at all levels show up in a way so that leaders can actually lead and not micromanage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a manager's ticket out of management and into leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the contributor's ticket out of being managed.
Mm-hmm.
And into a world where you're self-managed and you can receive good leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the whys for me.
Well, and Liz, as I say, as you say this, so I think about it, I'll do a quick visual for our audience. Here we have multipliers about great leaders. And now what I hear you saying, you're coming alongside and saying, now let's talk about how contributors become impact players. And it's a partnership. These two things go together to complete the equation. Every equal sign has something on either side to get to where you want to be. Liz, briefly tell us a little bit about the research process, and then let's get into some of the content. What was the research journey for you on this?
And is it okay if I share a couple slides to help with this?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Because I don't want to be verbose, and I think a picture will help us with this. So here, and honestly, I love research, and I can talk about research till everyone here drops off, and I don't want to do that. Here's what we did. So my team and I, we interviewed 170 managers. So let me back up. Like, to figure out what the best leaders did, I didn't go ask managers, hey, are you a good leader or a bad leader? And what do you do? It's like, oh, that's not trustworthy data. Everyone thinks they're a good leader from that point of view. I looked at leadership through the eyes of the contributor, whether that contributor was like a frontline employee or a senior leader themselves. And so to understand what good contributorship looked like, I looked at it through the eyes of managers. And I asked them to tell me about two different contributors. One who was smart, capable, and hardworking, who was doing really well. The other was someone who was smart, capable, and hardworking, who was making an extraordinary impact, an extraordinarily valuable and positive impact on the team. So there are there's no lackeys in this. Like, I'm not saying, tell me about a low performer. I'm like, in a room full of equally smart, capable people, give me someone who's sort of meeting expectations and doing, working to their potential, whereas other people are working so far beyond that. Now, half of the interviews, we did this comparison between these two. The other half, we asked someone to compare a smart, capable, hardworking contributor making a huge impact, the people that I call impact players, with what I then called an under contributor. And that was someone who was, to no surprise, smart, capable, and hardworking, but who was contributing clearly below their potential. And honestly, for me, those were the most fascinating people, because these are people who look like great hires. They're smart, they're talented, like they're doing a lot of the right things, but yet somehow they're missing the mark in a very significant way. And to me, like, that was sort of the tragedy in this. And we looked at what were their approach to work, what were their mindsets, what were their behaviors, how did they see their role, how did they, do A, B, C, and D, and what was the value they created. And boy, probably the first big surprise in this was the differential in value in the way that the managers estimated. They said that the impact players were contributing on average 3.5 times the level of value than ordinary contributors, and 10 times the value of these under contributors. But I think what most struck me in the research was how managers described what I kind of call a typical contributor. Throughout the book, it's called a typical contributor, but sort of that ordinary contributor, because the descriptions were things like this, like they did their job, they did it well, like they did it really well. They were very, very capable. They followed direction. They kind of followed me as a leader. They took ownership and responsibility. They were goal-oriented and they were focused, and they carried their weight on teams. Like, wow, that in some ways seems like an ideal team member. And kind of one of the first things that we found was that these ordinary contributors, they're stellar in ordinary times. And maybe that is kind of the big idea of the book, but they tended to fall short in times of uncertainty and ambiguity and chaos. And that's where the impact players handle these situations very, very differently. That was the essence of the research. And, there's a lot of sub research, but I'm assuming nobody wants me to go through all the like nits and bits, but
okay,
I'm happy to talk about it if anyone is interested.
I'm sure a lot of the audience would stay after the hour, but we won't do that today. And so impact players, when uncertainty or adversity hits, that's where their greatness begins to really show up. True? Go ahead and take us into some of the content, some of the key areas of learning from the book.
Yeah, I think the first big idea was that it was in these kind of moments of uncertainty and micro challenge that impact players distinguish themselves. You might think, oh, well, they were extraordinary in, moments of crisis, but actually it was how they handled what I called everyday challenges. And there were 5. As I was like, look, I remember being on the flight where I'm pouring through all the data, and I've got like this binders of data and analysis and behavioral analysis. And I'm looking at the situations that impact players handled differently, where the biggest differentials were. And I remember I had this yellow pad out, and I'm kind of organizing all of this. I'm like, wow, like I recognize these situations. And they were messy problems, like where, it's kind of a complex interdisciplinary issue. And it's not really like that department's job, and it's not that department's job, and it's not Keith's job, it's not Liz's job. It's like no one's job, but yet it's everyone's job.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, and they approach those very, very differently. The second was unclear roles that, when we're collaborating and we're working together, but we're not entirely sure who's the boss.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of organizations are leading towards these sort of boss-like systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And these situations make a lot of people uncomfortable. Like, well, wait a minute. Who's really in charge of what? And who's really in charge of this and us? The third was unforeseen obstacles, probably self-explanatory, but it's when that unprecedented stuff just like boom, drops in unannounced, and you're now facing something you couldn't have really planned for.
Right.
Not on the contingency plan, not even on the contingency plan to the contingency plan. And moving targets where situations are changing and needs are changing, and you have to decide, okay, like, what do I do with this? And like the market's giving us feedback that we need to be different. And maybe my colleagues are giving me feedback that I need to be different. And, it's where you're shooting at the goal, and the goal is moving while you're shooting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, just this sense of more work than we can possibly handle. And when the demands on a team are growing faster than the resources of a team. And as I look back, I'm like, wow, those are the everyday challenges of the modern work world.
Mm-hmm.
I've been out of the corporate world for about about 15 years, 15 going on 16 years. But every time I have lunch with one of my friends that still works like in an organization and has a manager, these are the topics that come up constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the kinds of challenges that if you leave a company because of these and you go work somewhere else,
you're going to find them again.
they're waiting for you there. They just, have different like nouns and things. So that was kind of the first big like aha was like this is kind of the dividing line between why some people do their job well versus other people have extraordinary impact. It's how they respond in these situations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Liz, one question. In the book, you talk about beliefs and behaviors both throughout. Just to shine a little bit of a spotlight on that real quick. I like how you holistically covered not only how people, what they do, but how they believe.
Well, I'm the daughter of a behavioralist. My mom was a special ed teacher and a principal. And, I was kind of raised with this sense. My mom always had this belief that you can change any behavior as long as you have like a jar of M&Ms, like some sort of reinforcement system. And so I've kind of grew up in my corporate experience, like, okay, well, it's about skills and making sure people understand the right skills and they have the skills and they practice the right behaviors. And the more I dig into this and the more I understand what makes people tick, is you get far more mileage by tuning beliefs than behavior. So my research, I'm always looking at what are the beliefs behind the behavior. And boy, we can argue this point, which is like, do you change your beliefs and then your behavior kind of falls in a cascade? Or do you change your behavior and then that shapes your belief? And that's a super fun discussion. I don't know. I see people work it both ways, but I like to understand, like, what are the assumptions that drive us to do things that are either high impact or low impact?
So you have these 5 areas or challenges coming every day in a culture. So keep sharing. What are some other principles around impact players that you would like to share?
Well, kind of the second thing was these choice points and what do most contributors or ordinary typical contributors do versus what do impact players do? And I think they're really choices. And I see Patrick's comment, can she show the traits on the slide for the impact players? And I don't have them on a single slide. So I'm just going to take you through 5 of these. But I have some words as well as a few pictures that I think illustrate the difference. So the first choice point is when we're dealing with these complex problems that sort of sit in no man's land. And do we stay in our lane or do we venture out? Like that's really the choice point. And what we find is that typical contributors tend to do their job. And it looks a little bit like this, which is sometimes we're so busy doing our job, we don't see what's going on around us. And sometimes we don't see the important work because we're just heads down doing our job. Whereas the impact players in those same situations, they do the job that needs to be done. I love this little image. You kind of have to look at it a couple times to see it. But, this man's just crossing the crosswalk and he sees this, biker headed out into danger. And he just like kind of jumps out. And the biker's reaction is kind of like, what are you doing to me? And this is kind of what impact players do, is they don't just say, well, that's not my job. I'm not the crosswalk, or boy, she should be looking. It's, I'm going to go and work where I am needed. And right now I'm needed right here. So that's kind of the difference in how they handle kind of the messiest of problems. When it comes to unclear roles, particularly where it's not a glaring problem, it's sort of what I call an ambient problem. Low grade issue, status quo is not optimal, but it's survivable. And so we tend to ignore a lot of these ambient problems in the workplace. And most people, when they see things that are suboptimal, they kind of wait for someone to tell them, hey, could you go fix this clunky business process? And there's, this is my little GIF that kind of captures.
Kind of waiting there.
Yeah, like, hey, I'm waiting for someone to anoint me the boss. Like they kind of wait to be knighted. Like they're willing to lead, but they're waiting to be kind of provoked into a leadership job. And what we find is the impact players, when there's this leadership vacuum or these kind of low grade problems, they're pretty quick to step up and lead, which not particularly surprising for really impactful, influential people. But what was surprising about the way they work is that they don't just step up, they as willingly step back. So, I think the model looks a lot more like a flock of migrating geese where, that one bird is willing to get out into the front and break the wind and create drag for the birds behind, but they don't stay in that role till they exhaust themselves and drop from the sky. They fall back and they let another bird lead. So it's this really fluid way of like, I'm needed here. Like this meeting doesn't have a leader, I'll do it. But I don't need to lead every meeting. I can follow as passionately as I lead. When it comes to those big like boulders that drop in our way, what we find is that ordinary contributors tend to escalate. Like they take responsibility, but then when things are so far out of their control, they tend to bump those up, which most organizations encourage, like, sort of bump it up to someone at that approval level or that pay grade, so to speak, where we find, it looks a little bit like this. It's like they start strong and they move along fine. And then when the obstacle hits, they're like, okay, I'm out. And they kind of hand that off to higher ups. Whereas the impact players, they don't just start strong, they finish strong. But they don't do it, like the nuance here is it's not like I'm going to own it, I'm going to hold it, and I'm going to get this thing done, and I'm going to like throw my body across the finish line and collapse. The model looks a lot more like the husky Malmu sled dog that I had such fun one day. Just my young son and I both love huskies, and really studying like why these dogs are so amazing is that they can finish like a multi-day endurance race with the same vital signs and the same like bio vitals that they started the race with. In fact, the ones that do well in the next race are often the ones that just completed a race. And so the impact players are kind of maintaining ownership of that. They're in it for the long haul, but they're not going it alone. They're bringing in reinforcements. They're getting senior managers involved, but they're not handing it off. They're still holding on. And, when things are moving fast, ordinary contributors tend to stick to what they know. There's a picture I think kind of captured it. And they see it often as like stoic and heroic, which is I'm staying focused. Like I had a goal, I'm focused on my goal. But meanwhile, the world has shifted. And so we find the difference here is that the impact player tends to be evolving and adapting and changing to fit their environment. And changing kind of beautifully. And there's some really wonderful nuance in this about like how they get out. They don't just react when someone tells them to change. It's almost like they show up at work assuming that like while I was sleeping, the world changed a little bit. And so I need to recalibrate constantly to make sure I'm doing things right. And lastly, when workloads are really heavy and, most people carry their weight, but when, there's that extra burden that they feel, like they're feeling that burden and they're sharing that burden with others, and they end up like kind of honestly becoming a burden to their leaders and their colleagues. Mm-hmm. Whereas the impact players, I chose this term, they make work light, because when things are hard, they provide lift. And it's not that they take other people's work, like, oh, I'll do that for you. Oh, I'll handle that. I'll do this. It's just that they're not hard to work with. They're easy to work with. They're low maintenance, and they bring kind of a sense of levity and a joyfulness. And, sometimes it's a real sense of fun that just makes it easier to bear the burden. Like they don't create a phantom workload. And those are kind of the 5 big things that we noticed.
Liz, and for the audience, as I went through the book, there were 3 pages that I dog-eared on the first time through. And so to Patrick's question, page 13 has a chart of the 5 practices of the impact players versus contributors. So one of the favorites that I'm referring to, take a look at page 13. That's a good first view of some of the things that Liz is presenting there. There we go.
Yeah, your book's not spiral bound. I got a special spiral bound one, so for my desk. It's kind of all like the mindsets and the behaviors are all summarized and contrasted there.
Yes. And that's one thing I enjoyed about multipliers. There were certain pages, and then the appendices were very valuable tools for a leader as they put it into practice in the culture. Liz, another area, talk about looking through the lens, the threat lens and the opportunity lens, and what you learned about that regarding impact players. I thought that was fantastic.
Well, you know what? It's my favorite diagram in the book. And it's because I kind of let my inner child go loose on this one. Here's what we found. Like one of the big differences is, there are these kind of like ways they handle these different situations. But if I had to kind of like pull back from it, like fundamentally what's going on is that when faced with situations fraught with uncertainty and ambiguity and chaos, that most people quite reasonably want to avoid those situations. Like, not my job, not my role, like unclear, big, messy obstacle out of our control. Like when situations are out of their control, most of us want to avoid them. Whereas the impact player tends to move into them, and they tend to, the metaphor that I think of is when you're out in the ocean and there's a massive oncoming wave, you have to make a decision. Like, what do you do? And for me, my default decision is run, like turn my back, get out of there. And then of course the wave takes me down, I get tumbled and, tossed. But if you watch an experienced ocean surfer or, ocean swimmer, like they go into those waves and they go head on in and they dive through them and get out to the other side. And that's very much what these impact players are doing, is they are moving toward the uncertainty because there's a chance there to add value. Like, yes, it's scary, but like on the other side of that wave are like waves that you can surf, and their lens is different. And the reason why they can move into them is because most people are seeing this, or oftentimes we tend to see it with like a threat lens. And they tend to see it through an opportunity lens. And I think maybe the title of that little section is that impact players wear opportunity goggles. And I'm looking for the little chart in the book. I like this because I was like working with the artist. I'm like, can you draw me like some bees? And I'll go back and I'll maybe share this on my screen. I've got a different version of that chart. See, like by metaphor, it's like when we see a bee, what do we do? Now, through the threat lens, you're like, okay, there's a bee, there could be a swarm, let me run. Whereas the opportunity lens would tell you, okay, there's a bee, but that's an opportunity to make honey. So what do is you go and you build a hive. Like impact players are people who will build a hive where other people would run.
And that was my second favorite pages. Page 214 and 215 has that visual for those listening who have received their books. Now, Liz, someone...
appreciate people caring about this book and being willing to dive into it. It's like, it makes me so happy, like after spending so much time on the research and the writing, that this group would dig into it. So thank you.
Oh, you are more than welcome.
And I think those are the pages that you're referring to.
So Liz, for a leader listening in, so we have coaches and their clients listening in, what would be their first step? So they read the book, they begin to study about impact players. Let's say a leader has 10 to 12 on their team. What are their first steps to begin to say, okay, these are my impact players, and then these are the candidates that I might be able to develop into impact leaders? Talk about the identification and the development of impact players.
Well, I want to start on the most outward kind of reaction, and then I want to back up. The way you asked the question, Keith, made me think that there's sort of an outward response, but there's probably a more important inward response. Mm-hmm. See, a lot of leaders, every manager that I gave this book to review while I was writing had the same reaction to it, which is, oh, wow, like this categorized people. Like I can identify people on my team who are impact players and people who aren't. Like, wow, names started to come up. Mm-hmm. And then the second reaction has been the same for almost everyone, which is, how do I get more of these impact players on my team? Mm-hmm. Which is a perfectly reasonable question to ask. And, there's a chapter in the book on how do you build a high impact team. And there's a number of things we can talk about here. But like before going to this, let me categorize people on my team. Let me try to hire more impact players. Let me try to spread the mindset across the team. All reasonable things to do. Like if we back up a bit, we might ask ourselves, well, am I thinking and operating like an impact player? Mm-hmm. Or am I kind of going through the motions of my job? Like, has there been a time in my career where I was more of an impact player, operating with more of this mindset? Because the mindsets of the leaders have a huge effect on the mindsets of the teams. We know this. You also might ask, am I leading in a way that would enable people to think and work this way? Like I'm absolutely certain, I'm 100% certain from my work studying multiplying leaders and diminishing leaders that everyone, absolutely everyone comes to work wanting to contribute at their fullest. And I think people who have explored these ideas with people have seen this as well. Like it's exhilarating when we can, and it's pretty painful when we can't. Like some people have learned not to, for sure. But people want to contribute. It's like it's wired into us. Like we crave impact and development and usage of our mind and our talents. So like a leader might say, am I thinking and operating this way? And wow, am I enabling this kind of behavior and thinking on my team? Or am I like, no, do your job. Like what I need for, and I tell you, in this process of like finishing the book and launching the book, there are times where I was like, I just need everybody to do their job. Like I can't do my job unless they do their jobs. Will you just do your job? Like, and I'm like, whoa, that's like telling people essentially, no, don't step out of the role. Don't think, And so I think we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. I'm getting reactions already from readers saying, I just want to do this. I was just on the Brene Brown podcast. It just came out on Monday. And so I've been seeing this like flood of responses of how people have reacted. And I've seen too many people who say, I want to work this way. I need to work this way. I believe this, but my boss doesn't allow it.
Interesting.
Yeah, because we've got to give people space to venture out and do the right thing. We have to give people permission to say, no one's appointed me to lead, but I will take the lead. We also have to be willing to let people recede and say, okay, I was leading here, but I don't have to always lead. Let's have someone else take the lead on this, to adjust and say, okay, yeah, I know that was the objective, but I think the world has changed. Can we update the goal? Like, can at least in our mind, like we have to let go of the rigidity that keeps people from doing things of influence and impact.
And so, in addition to the leader, the culture that has been created by the leader and previous leaders is very, very important in the process.
Oh, absolutely. That's kind of part of the warranty calls that I would get where people are like, I tried it. I did it. Yeah. In fact, if you are online and you've gotten like those same warranty calls, like feel free to share insights of how you've helped people. But, like I'm doing it all right, but people aren't responding. Well, what happens when people have been historically diminished?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing if it's from past leaders and you're coming in with a new leadership style, they might be like, ooh, we're not sure we trust this new gal. But what if that historical diminisher has been you? Like, even with the best of intentions, then it's almost worse because they're like, what is up with Liz? Like, did she go to some seminar? And like, I'm not sure I can trust the trajectory of this behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what happens when she reverts back and I get my hand slapped?
Mm-hmm.
For being innovative. So I think we have to, before we think about how do I build a team like this, I think we have to stop and think, am I leading in a way that people can do this? And have I created the environment of safety that enables people to really stretch?
Which points back to start with multipliers in a way, doesn't it? Am I a multiplier leader? Am I embracing that? And then turning to, okay, I see my impact players because I've read impact players and it's just intuitive. Now, how do I build impact players?
Yeah. Yeah, I can kind of make a case that you can't do this without multiplier leaders.
Yes.
But I can as strongly make the case that when you work this way, you don't need multiplier leaders. Because you're self-managing and, it's in some ways, it's a little bit diminisher proof. You probably need some savvy for like how to deal with diminishers, but like, you don't need to wait for your boss to tell you what to do. Like, you can take a lot of that initiative yourself. Now, there are some notable cases where there are some bosses that have some sociopathic tendencies, and even the best intended contributor is going to run into some trouble. But yeah, in some ways, if you work with this mindset, you can get around some diminishing leadership.
And Liz, you've used the term mindset many times. And as I've gone through the book, that is one of the most common terms in it. And my third favorite area is page 239, where it talks about the coachability of impact players. Can you talk a little bit about the coachability of impact players and what they bring to the table? And for the readers, chapter 8 focuses on hiring and building a team of impact players. There we go.
And the chart looks like this. So I had two nagging worries the whole time I'm doing the research and the whole time I'm writing the book. One of them is, and maybe we'll get to this, is like, well, what about all the people? What about the missing impact player? what about the people who work behind the scenes, or who are a little introverted, or maybe who work, or maybe who come from an underrepresented group, who aren't even being given that chance, or who are doing all of these things but remain unseen, unrecognized, maybe even punished in some ways for stepping up and taking the lead and trying to play in big, impactful ways. So that was a nagging concern. And you'll see that kind of as a little bit of a thread throughout the book. And I think that actually warrants a lot more like rich discussion and thought on this. The second nagging concern was like, yeah, but is this actually learnable? Like, some of these things seem like you might have needed to learn them at your mother's knee, or had like the right dad who sat you down and taught you about principles. And so one of the things we did was to do a little piece of research on how coachable some of these mindsets and practices are. And I'm like, we turned to the research in psychology, and there's not a lot out there, nothing that will make too many declarations about how coachable some of the belief systems. So what I did was I took all the components of the framework, and I went out to the Marshall Goldsmith 100 group and said, you know what, it's kind of a international group, coached a lot of leaders, and I asked them to assess in their experience the coachability or learnability of each one of these things. And then I stratified them to like the least coachable to the most coachable, with the value of that analysis is really acknowledging that not all of them are easily coached and learned and changed. And those are the ones that you should hire for. And there are some that are very easy to adopt and learn. And those are the ones you should train for. And trying to help people really, I think one of the reasons why managers aren't great coaches is because like their coaching efforts don't pay off. And they're probably trying to coach things that aren't very easy for people to change. Like, oh, I just am this way. Like life taught this to me. And it's hard to change.
You also talk about in the book recruiting impact players. And I believe, again, that's in chapter 8. So you can potentially coach up team members to be impact players. You just addressed that. How about recruiting and attracting impact players?
Well, I think it's good. It's helpful to use a sports metaphor here. That great players won't work for bad coaches. They're like, oh no, I'm not playing on that team because the team doesn't have a good culture. It doesn't have a great coach. And it's going to be hard to bring impact players onto your team if you aren't enabling them. And if you aren't leading in ways that is conducive. So I think like if you want to recruit impact players, first start by being the kind of coach that they would work for, or a manager that they would work for. And then the book offers some tools. And I know, Keith, this wasn't one of your favorite charts. It is kind of one of mine. It's not a very like glamorous chart, but I think there's some things that we can do to hire for these behaviors and mindsets. And, there's some guidance in there on how to do behavioral-based interviewing around this. And I think it's very conducive to this because, we know that there are these 5 situations that are big differentiators. Well, if you want to hire an impact player, like maybe you need someone who can deal well with obstacles or messy problems. And so it's, and so instead of a STAR, situation, task, action, result, like you can ask for a SOAR, an SOAR. Okay, tell me about a time when you dealt with a lot of ambiguity. O is outlook. Like, how did you think about it? What were you telling yourself about it? What did you do and what happened? So I think there's some tools that can help people find people who come with this mentality.
And that's where it gets very practical for the listener reader. Jeff from Minneapolis put in the chat that in reading the book, he just finished it. He said one of the number one hindrance to an impact player potentially is being over ambitious. What did you find there, and do you have a story or anything you could share there?
Oh boy. Yeah, there's like maybe a favorite part of the book that a lot of people won't get to is what's in the appendix, and that is two lists. And it's my absolute favorite part of it. And because in this research, I always throw in something there that like I just want to know about. And I asked every one of those managers, what is it that people do that you absolutely love? Like what makes your job as a leader delightful? There's a list of 15 behaviors that these are the things that managers love when people do. Well, if you do those things, it's going to increase your influence. It's going to build your credibility upward. I also asked, what do people do that you absolutely hate? And I tell you, of those 170 managers, most were like, oh, nothing really. And then they're like, really? You want to know? And then like it just pours out. And one of the things that really, really gets most leaders is when people are passionate about their stuff, but not about the work of the team. And it's one of these things that kind of is like a decoy of people who come in and they're like super passionate. They're trying to get the team excited about what they're excited about. And they really end up under contributors because they're annoying to work with. I was thinking of all sorts of stories there that I probably shouldn't share, but you know, the impact players are the people who say, you know what, I will figure out what's important to the people I serve, and I will make it important to me. And I guess pretty early on in the book, I share this story. I'll try to sum it up now. It's like, I was one of those annoying people early in my career. I came out of grad school. I'm like, I want to teach leadership. And I tried to get a job for a management training company. And they're like, hey, maybe you should get some management experience before trying to teach others. I'm like, oh man, they don't understand my passion. And then I go to work for Oracle, so a backup job. And about a year in, I have this opportunity to go and work in the internal training group, which runs all the technical boot camps. But I'm seeing like, no, as a company is growing, their charter will expand to include management training. So I interview for the job. I'm interviewing with the VP. We get to the part of the interview where I can kind of like take charge. And I'm like, oh, let me make my case for why Oracle needs management training and why I'm the person to do it. And I would love to do it. And I'm all like ambitious and excited about this. And Bob, he says, well, Liz, that's great. Kind of like pats me on the head a little bit metaphorically, like, that's great, but your boss has a different problem. She's got to figure out how to get 200 people up to speed on Oracle technology this next year. Like, it would be great if you could help her do that. And he certainly wasn't insulting. He wasn't rude. He was actually extremely polite. But for me, it's this huge aha. I'm like, oh, yeah. Like, that's what's important to me, but it's not what's important to the company at this point in time. So let me figure out. Essentially what he was saying is like, Liz, make yourself useful. Like, do things that are useful and valuable. I'm like, but that's not what I want to do. It's not what I'm passionate about. And I decided, okay, let me get passionate about that. And let me sign up to be a technical instructor and teach programming to, a bunch of hotshot programmers coming out of MIT, which wasn't really pleasant at first. Mm-hmm. But it's, Jeff's point is like, there's a lot of things that seem impactful, like passion, like being ambitious, like asking for a lot of feedback, asking for a promotion. And these are all things that end up on the things managers hate list. A lot of times it's playing too big. It's being overeager. It's working really hard, but not seeing what's really needed. And there's so many sort of deceptions and decoys.
Mm-hmm. So Appendix A has both sides of the coin, which is fantastic. And so, Liz, what I hear you saying, impact players are willing to set their ambition and their agenda aside to do what we would call for the good of the order. What does the company need and what does my management team need? And then really lean into that.
Yes, but it's not forever. So this isn't a message that says, just do what you're asked to do, play in the backgrounds, be quiet, and just serve. It's not that. It's if you want a bigger voice, like first listen to other people's voice. It's if you want to have a lot of influence, like figure out what needs to be done and do that. Because when I know this was for me, what changed my career, sort of my whole life, was because I was willing to do that. When it was time to hand out the big management job, they're like, Liz, Larry wants you to manage the group. I'm like, I don't want to manage the group. I'm having fun teaching. Like, no, we want you to do it. I'm like, yeah, ask her, ask him. They want to do it. No, we want you to do it. And it wasn't superior intelligence and it wasn't like natural management skills. I think it was because I was willing to care about the things that they cared about, and that I was willing to learn and inconvenience myself to like do what was most relevant. That they're like, this is someone who will lead that way as well. And the more that I worked on the agenda of the company rather than my own personal agenda, bigger opportunities, more influence, and soon, like, you're helping to set that agenda. So it's not about staying small and being subservient. It's about working where there's energy.
And Liz, as we prepared for today, I'd ask, what's the relationship between impact players to multipliers? I think you covered that earlier, but if there's anything else you want to say to that as we get ready to close, please do. But also share, what was the biggest surprise in the research? What was your biggest wow? I wasn't really expecting this.
Keith, I think you captured the relationship between multipliers and impact players very well. They're two parts of the equation. They're both variables in the equation. I think the biggest surprise was probably something I was hoping wasn't true, but I thought was true, is I expected out of 170 impact players that there would be a fair number of prima donnas, like superstars, big egos, bullheaded kind of folks that were like getting, big stuff done. And it's just not what we found at all. And, I went back and I've got this incredible data scientist on my team, and she lets me get away with nothing that isn't 100% true. And that's her job. I'm like, you keep me honest, Lauren. But she went back, we looked through the transcripts of every interview and we combed through it. We could not find any evidence that any of these impact players were bullies or even like bulls in China shop, prima donnas. Like, they were people who served the team. They didn't do it quietly necessarily. They did it in big, bold ways, but they were serving the team. Now, there was a couple that didn't start their career that way. They were a little bit more like me, kind of like my own prima donna experience. Like, hey, let me do what I want. But like, they evolved over time, and the trust that their managers place in them is enormous. Like, just hearing the managers talk about these impact players is kind of a beautiful thing to watch.
It's like the pride of a parent in a way, I bet you.
But I still worry. About the missing impact player, the one that the leaders and the colleagues can't see because they've chosen not to see them.
They're there in the culture doing the work, but they may not be visible. Interesting.
Underappreciated, taken for granted. Now, there's some things that they can do to prevent that. But fundamentally, this is the job of the leader, is to create an environment where everyone can contribute, everyone can do work that matters. And the people who are doing really valuable work don't end up in the back of the line when it's time to dole out recognition.
Mm-hmm. So, Liz, as we prepare to close, let's talk about some practical resources. So, impactplayersbook.com and the wisemangroup.com are two URLs the audience can go to. What are some of the resources they might find there in addition to the book?
Well, let me see. There you will find the full model. Like I've never done this before, but it was really important to me. I wanted to put it in the book, but my publisher asked me to put it on the website. So there's all of this all put together on one page, including the under contributor parts, which I chose not to put in the book. I have mild references to it, but I'm like, I'm not going to write the book about this tragedy of the under contributor. I'm going to write it about the difference between people doing really well and people having a huge impact. So I wrote it on that upper margin. But all of that is there. It's called like the Impact Player Framework. There's a discussion guide. It is a V1 discussion guide, and it's good. I don't think it's great yet. I would love help in making that great. Like use it, tell us what's wrong. We will ask and adjust. You'll also find there, I know there's something else there. There's a third document. I don't know what that is. I'm forgetting entirely. Maybe someone will go out to the website and look and tell me what that is. But you'll also find the quiz out there. Maybe that is the third thing. I don't know. But there's a little quiz, and the quiz is focused on what might be impeding people's impact, similar to Jeff's question. Like, can being a little bit too ambitious, too eager be an impediment?
Mm-hmm. Well, and Liz, as we wind up, I just really want to highlight what you just shared. So for those listening in, as you read the book and look at the model, as a researcher, Liz and team Sean love feedback. So feel free to message Liz directly at liz@thewisemangroup.com or Sean, SHAWN, at thewisemangroup.com with any feedback as you digest the book and the discussion guide. Liz, any final comments for our audience before we thank you and let you get back to your day?
Well, I do have a final comment, and it's just that I think you ask any author, like once they write the book is when the learning really starts. And I feel like I'm just now learning about these ideas, and like, teach me what you are finding. Because I think that like the best thinking is still to come on this.
Yes. Somewhat what you learned as you shared with me last week or earlier this week on multipliers. The greatness, it was something you wrote that was great, but a lot of the greatness followed the launch of the book over the last 10, 12 years. So
there's a collective intelligence that will be built.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. Liz Wiseman from her home, Silicon Valley. And Liz, we look forward to future interactions. Thank you again.
Well, thanks for all the wonderful collaboration.
Okay, thank you. And right now we're going to put up on the screen how to order the book. Everyone, you can go to the impactplayersbook.com and order the book. And we'd love for you to do that. If you want to make it simple, you can scan the QR code here. And please, after you have read the book, mark it up, write in it, and then thoughtfully send a little message to Liz or Sean. That's Liz or SHAWN, thewisemangroup.com. And if you love the book, go ahead and go on Amazon, write a little quick review, give it a little thumbs up. Everyone, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in 1 month for our next Global Business Leader Forum. Until then, take care and be safe.